I was just told that I'm starting the program. so, uh, so welcome to the Kennedy Library. I'm Stephen Kennedy Smith. My father was the first president of the Kennedy Library and a very close associate of John and Robert Kennedy. And it's my pleasure tonight to welcome you all here and also introduce my longtime friend and someone I really admire, Mark Collins. And, so Mark called me before, actually yesterday, and I thought he wanted to go over the program, what I was going to say, what he was going to say, but he actually said, please do not read my bio because I don't want it, because it's just going to be boring. So that is very typical of Mark's self-deprecating way of going about life. And when I first met him, we worked together on a study commission for Frank Thomas, who was then head of the Ford Foundation, on U.S. policy to Southern Africa. And I noticed that he was a very self-effacing, very intelligent, very thoughtful person. And as I was reflecting on John F. Kennedy and Doug Dillon's relationship, they were very different people. You know, Norman Mailer said in his essay about President Kennedy that his persona had the undertone of the cool hint of jazz. And you know, when Dwight Eisenhower, who Doug Dillon worked for, left the presidency, one of the last things he said was that he didn't like the dance, the twist, that he thought it was very vulgar. And in the Kennedy administration, they did the twist. They actually did have the twist in the White House. So Doug Dillon and John Kennedy were very different kinds of people. But I think what President Kennedy admired, you know, about Douglas Dillon was his sense of judgment, his sense of probity, his coolness under pressure. He served, of course, on ExComm during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was very instrumental in the Alliance for Progress and the Kennedy tax cuts. And so it's really a pleasure, Mark, to have you here as his grandson, celebrating his legacy, because this library is a living laboratory for democracy, and we celebrate not only President Kennedy's legacy, but the legacy of people like Doug Dillon, who left an impact that was lasting on America. So now that I've said that, I do want to say I'm going to violate Mark's request and just say that in the tradition of the Kennedy hospitality, we always do that. So Mark is like Doug Dillon, he's a very quiet, effective, thoughtful person who is public-spirited. He's involved in the Audubon Society. He's chairman of Living Learning, which is an incredible program for kids. He's served as a trustee for the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So in his own way, he's carrying on the legacy, I think, of his family's contribution to public life. Thank you all for being here, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce my friend Mark.
Nice. Yeah. Well, Stephen, thank you ever so much. And back to Eisenhower, I think he mentioned also that jazz was our best soft power, which in a way is right. You know, you just think about music. And that Eisenhower would say that, find that sort of surprising. But there we are. Anyhow, so wonderful to be here. And I just want to say, you know, our families were really close way back. And it's just so nice to have this opportunity to be here this evening. Because in the day when our families really were close, I was running around in short pants, right? And it's so nice just to see the relationship carrying on. And the warmth that continues is just great. And what a wonderful place to celebrate it, right here at the Kennedy Library. So I want to thank those of you here who've been part of this, the Library Foundation, for the support for this very, very special place. And I also want to thank some friends for being with us this evening. So at the outset, I'll invite all of you to fasten your seatbelts, because we're going to do a little time travel tonight. We're going to go back to a very different era. This was a time when the the United States steadfastly supported a European capital in distress, the Berlin airlift. This was a time when the world nearly came to nuclear war, or called the Suez Crisis, right? This was a time when Russia backed autocrats. They were seeking to destabilize democracies, and of course, invaded Ukraine. Does it sound familiar, any of this, to any of you, right? This also was a period here at home of economic fragility and also difficulty. There are hard times. And so not long after President Kennedy was elected, he soon realized that if he were to be successful in achieving his domestic and international priorities, that he certainly had to put the economic house in order. So what did he do? He reached across the aisle to Douglas Dillon. Now, this is a story that deserves to be told. I couldn't imagine a better person to do it than our author, Richard Aldous, this evening, who will be speaking. Richard is steeped in the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations. And, he just saw in this subject, he saw the promise for biographical white space. And so he plumbed the depths and took the plunge into the Dillon era. So on behalf of students of history and my family, we're deeply grateful on two fronts. The first was the quality of Richard's work, and then his inspiration to carry on with the digitization of Dillon's papers here at the Kennedy Library. So what may have seemed stale previously now has been ventilated and is available for all comers. And given the period and given the relevance for today, this is bringing an era in the past to light that is so relevant for our times today. So Rachel Floor, I'll pass the podium over to you if you could pick up, and we'll carry on. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Rachel Floor, and I'm the Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation. It's so wonderful to be here with all of you, to be here with Mark, Stephen, and really thank you to Mark for your support of, and the Dillon Fund's support of our digitization program and tonight's event. I also want to thank, we have a number of our board members here and New Frontier Network members and board of advisors. Could you all just give a little wave while we're here? So it's really nice. Thank you for, these are the people who make all of this work happen for us and support the work of the Kennedy Library Foundation. So President Kennedy, as we know, was always looking to new frontiers, and tonight's we're talking about history, but as Mark said, history is always present here at the Kennedy Library. We can always make history present here at the Kennedy Library. And as it turns out, he was incredibly prescient about one thing that you probably don't know about, which was how we would store and share information in the future. And in an incredibly foreshadowing of today's digital universe, President Kennedy held a 1962 press conference in which he was asked if he would ever consider establishing his presidential library in Washington, D.C. And President Kennedy thought about it, and he said yes, he'd consider it, and his library would be in Cambridge. And after getting a nice laugh from the crowd, he went on to explain that he believed that by scientific means of reproduction, we would find it possible to reproduce the key documents so that they will be commonly available. And of course, President Kennedy didn't live to realize his vision for his presidential library, but you'd have to believe that he would be pleased to know that his archives from the library in Boston have indeed been scientifically reproduced and serve as a critical resource of study of history. So the library, of course, is a vast resource of textual documents, photographs, audio recordings, and films. And included among these history treasures are irreplaceable records tracing history from the nation's struggle for civil rights, its conflict with the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War, its commitment to public service through the creation of the Peace Corps, and more. But since embarking on our own technological new frontier with the launch of our digital archives in 2011, we've digitized almost 2 million items, representing just 7% of our holdings. And we are so thrilled to count the C. Douglas Dillon Personal Papers in that number. So with that, I'm delighted to now introduce our fireside chat guests for their discussion of the Dillon era. And I did not give them the opportunity to decline me reading their bio, so I will. Sorry, Fred. Professor Richard Aldous, author of the Dillon Era, is the Eugene Meyer Distinguished Professor of History at Bard College. He is a contributing editor for the American Interest, a founding member of the editorial team at American Purpose magazine, and host of the Bookstock podcast. In addition to contributing to major news publications and networks, he was the Spectrum News NY1 royal expert for coverage of the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II and the coronation of King Charles III. He's the author of a number of acclaimed books with subjects ranging from Harold Macmillan, Ronald Reagan, and Margaret Thatcher's political relationship, Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr.'s life, and of course, Douglas Dillon. It's also a pleasure to welcome our moderator this evening, Professor Fredrik Logevall. He's the Laurence D. Belfer Professor of International Affairs at the John F. Kennedy School of Government and Professor of History at Harvard University. He's the author or editor of 10 books, most recently, JFK Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917 to 1956. And he won the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for History for his book, Ember of War, The Fall of an Empire and the Making of America's Vietnam. A native of Stockholm, Sweden, he holds a PhD in history from Yale University and is a past president of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Well, what a pleasure it is to be with you. I want to say one thing before we launch in, and I know I speak for Richard in saying this. I'm now working on volume 2 of JFK. This library, you all know this, but it's worth saying, and I think Richard will affirm this. This library is just absolutely phenomenal, and the holdings, 7% of which, as we just heard from Rachel, are now available to anybody anywhere in the world at any time, which, by the way, is better, is a higher percentage than you'll see, and a higher number than you'll see in any other NERA facility. But then the stuff that's here, that has not yet been digitized, it's just an absolute goldmine for me and for anybody else who works here. So it just adds to, I think, why this is such a privilege for me to be with you tonight and to be here with Richard and have a chance to talk about this magnificent book. Some of you have read the book, others have not. You're in for a treat in a lot of ways in terms of understanding this extraordinary era. One of the things I'd like to do tonight is to talk a little bit about that era as compared to where we are today. So a warning that I will not be able to resist a certain contemporaneous connection that I'd like to draw. But let me start, Richard, by having you talk a little bit about the book. And I guess there's one thing you say I think it's in your preface, or it's certainly early in the book. You say that Douglas Dillon is, if not a forgotten figure, then a largely overlooked and underappreciated one. So there's that. And yet, the title of this book which is apt, is the Dillon Era, which speaks to his fundamental importance. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that contradiction. Underappreciated, maybe not forgotten, but certainly not given the credit that he's due, and yet this is the Dillon Era.
Well, first of all, Fred, can I say what an absolute pleasure it is to be here in conversation with you tonight. I'd certainly echo everything that you've said about this wonderful facility, the JFK Library. And I think I'd particularly like to say on this occasion that what a wonderful thing that the Dillon family, spearheaded by Mark Collins,
indeed,
have done by digitizing these papers. One of the challenges that historians, particularly young historians, often face is simply the financial challenge of getting to archives. So being able to view these papers, read these papers from wherever they are, anywhere in the world, is actually a wonderfully democratizing thing for historical scholarship and young scholars. And I think very much in keeping with the spirit of the Kennedy era. Yeah. Douglas Dillon is somebody that I was thinking about when I was writing my previous book on Arthur Schlesinger, somebody that you know well through your wonderful work on JFK. And I was very struck that Schlesinger was somebody who was completely opposed to the appointment of Douglas Dillon as Treasury Secretary. He thought it was appalling that this Republican, this Wall Street figure, was going to have this stranglehold on the new administration's financial and economic policy. And he, being Arthur Schlesinger, was not shy in telling everybody, including the president-elect, that he did not think that Dillon should be appointed. And yet, within a year of Dillon being in post, Schlesinger in his diary writes about how he's a tremendous admirer of Dillon, that actually he's his biggest fan, he says to somebody that he runs into from the Treasury in the street in Washington. And so it kind of intrigued me that there are a lot of very high-profile figures in the Kennedy administration. There's a lot of testosterone in the Kennedy administration through people like Robert McNamara. And Douglas Dillon is almost the opposite of that, in the sense that he's incredibly effective, unbelievably hard-nosed when he needs to be, diplomatic when he needs to be, incredibly skillful at playing the game, has a kind of a sense of strategic vision and tactical nous. And yet, when we think about the Kennedy administration, we very rarely talk about him. And so it was really that sense of the dichotomy that really interested me. And although people recognized it at the time, Theodore White, for example, says that Dillon's tax cuts and the civil rights legislation or the civil rights bill becoming legislation are the two great landmarks of the Kennedy administration. And yet we talk a lot about the one, but very rarely about the other.
Just to underscore something that Richard said at the beginning. So I happened to jot this down for tonight. So on November 30th, this is after the Kennedy's election, but of course before he takes office. So he's deciding on his cabinet, and on the 30th of November, he and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. are talking about these cabinet appointments. And Arthur says, as Richard pointed out, you can't appoint this guy. He's a Republican. Not only that, I'm paraphrasing, but not only that, Jack, or maybe Mr. President-elect at this point. Not only that, Nixon, had he won, might have appointed Dillon to the same position. And I just love Kennedy's response. This says something about President Kennedy. Kennedy said, "Oh, I don't care about those things. All I want to know is he able, and will he go along with the program?" So party affiliation didn't matter very much. But so Dillon you know, he's a man of privilege. You probably don't get more privilege than the following. His family owned one of the finest vineyards in Bordeaux, Château-Aubryon. So he's obviously of immense privilege, and yet he dedicates himself to public service. He wasn't alone in doing that. It's something about maybe that generation. But talk a little bit about his motivation in wanting to think beyond himself and his own family and give something back.
Yeah, I think you've really hit on something important there. I mean, to paraphrase another important figure from the period, or slightly kind of adapt it, you know, with great privilege comes great responsibility.
Yeah.
And I think Douglas Dillon felt that very keenly, actually. I mean, in some ways, of course, he is part of that greatest generation that he serves during the Second World War. And although, as you say, he comes from a privileged background, there's a kind of modesty to him and the way that he lives. I wouldn't want to overstate that in terms of the things that he's able to surround himself with, the kind of education he has, and so on. But there's a real sense that he recognizes that he can't just simply live off the money that he has to put something back into the system. And you see that in all kinds of ways. You see it politically, but you also see it through the work that he does with the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's involved in the Bed-Stuy project in New York, very often working in projects with poverty, involving poverty. And in some ways, I think that philosophically, he's the person who embodies that idea that Richard Rorty talks about, that, you know, for change to come, yes, it has to come from the bottom up. There has to be a grassroots element to it. Yeah. But you also have to have those who are in society, who are secure in their place, to, in Rorty's phrase, lend a hand. And I think that is what Douglas Dillon does. He recognizes that, yes, through circumstances of birth, he's part of an elite, but he knows that he has to lend a hand in terms of making society a better place.
That's powerful. And what's the relationship, would you say, Richard? And you can focus here exclusively on Dillon if you wish. But because you know this era so well, I'm also interested if you want to address it more generally. And this is something I'm trying to think about even with respect to John F. Kennedy. The relationship between public service and personal ambition. Is he somebody who is, because certainly in the case of JFK, President Kennedy, I would say the two go very much hand in hand. Very ambitious. He wants to be president of the United States. But there is, from childhood, from his mother Rose in particular, but also from his father, and there is this idea of this belief in public service that I think President Kennedy has. Clearly Douglas Dillon has it as well. Is that personal ambition politically also there, or not so much?
I think there is a personal ambition. Obviously, I can't see how you could get to the positions that he did without having political ambition. But I think that a lot of what he does is, well, there are two elements. The personal side, a lot of it is being able to establish himself as his own man. That, as you pointed out earlier, he has an incredibly powerful, very successful father, Laurence Dillon, who is a titan on Wall Street. And early on in his career, Douglas Dillon follows very much in his father's footsteps. He works in his father's office. He has a seat on the stock exchange. He runs the closed-end trust that manages most of the family's money, and he could have stayed doing that for the rest of his life. But I think he recognizes in politics that it's something that can be his own sphere. where he can make his own mark. And it's somewhere where others who'd been very close to Laurence Dillon, like Paul Nitzer and Forrestal, these kind of characters, it was a pathway that they had also taken. So I think there's that personal level. And then I think once he's there, he has this kind of, I suppose, broader sense of believing in the international order. Yes, I think he does identify the interests of Wall Street and the United States with the global order through things like the IMF and the OECD and GATT rounds, all things that he becomes involved with. But I think a lot of the ambition for him is a sense that I could actually do this better. You know, I can organize this better. I can see how this can work. I can do a really effective, efficient job here. So yes, there is ambition, but it's not of that kind of naked ambition that you very often see. And I think that this is to some degree conjecture, but I think part of the reason as well is that he has the confidence to do what he thinks is right, A, because of a sense of moral purpose, but B, because if it doesn't work out, he can go back to Wall Street. There's still that whole world that he can go, and that gives him, ironically, more power, because it means that he's never afraid to speak truth to power, to use the cliche.
Well, listening to you, it occurs to me not to spend too much time comparing the two men, but they certainly have things in common. When you talked about this very dominant father figure, we could say the same thing about, obviously, Joseph Kennedy. And it's interesting that Dillon follows in his father's footsteps, whereas I think it's the case with Jack Kennedy and really the Kennedy kids. They don't really want to pursue the kind of career that Joe Kennedy did. So there is that difference. But there are also these similarities, and I think Stephen maybe referred to these a little bit earlier about a certain self-possession, a kind of calmness under pressure. You open the book so powerfully, as you'll all see when you read it. But when the news arrives that President Kennedy has been shot, and then later that he's been killed, that he died, and the one who sort of keeps his head throughout this process is Doug Dillon. He, in a sense, I think you're saying, takes charge. I'm not sure what the question is in there. Let me suggest this, because it would be interesting, I think, for folks to know. So Schlesinger, let's go back to the appointment. Schlesinger is basically saying, Jack, don't do this. He does it. Why does he appoint Dillon as Secretary of Treasury?
So I think there are a couple of reasons. Number one is because he does get on well with him personally. There's a meshing of characters there. So the personal element feels right. But he also recognizes that he wants to keep Wall Street on side. And so by having Douglas Dillon there, it's kind of reassuring. I also have this theory about Kennedy that when he's appointing people to say things, he appoints liberals. The most obvious being Schlesinger, his other speech writers, and so he kind of talks to Galbraith and kind of these kind of people. When he's appointing people to do things, he goes for Republicans. There's Dillon at the Treasury. McNamara is a registered Republican.
The Secretary of Defense, yes.
Secretary of Defense. George Bundy is a Republican. So the kind of the hands-on people tend to be Republicans, whereas the characters like Sorensen and Schlesinger and Galbraith, who are the more the ones who are articulating the vision, very often are the liberals. So I think that Dillon fits into that pattern as well.
I wonder if there's also this, that he has State Department experience. Dillon does, in the 1950s. And the Treasury Department is going to be more and more involved in foreign policy, as we've certainly seen more recently. It's now in many respects, heavily foreign policy-oriented department. That was another asset, I suppose. I don't know whether that entered into Kennedy's thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there are direct things there. So, for example, when Dillon was at the State Department, he was instrumental in putting together various loan banks for kind of international countries and so on, and that will feed directly into the Alliance for Progress in the Kennedy administration that Dillon spearheads. So there are definite connections, but as well, it's interesting that Sorensen, his speechwriter, recalls Kennedy saying that there were two things that kept him awake at night. One was the threat of nuclear annihilation. As you would imagine, but the other is the balance of payments and the deficit there. And so, one of the reasons why he brings Dillon in is to try and address that, to look after that. I think as well, the State Department point is a good one, because one of the things that Kennedy wants to do is to increase defense expenditure. And so he sees Dillon as someone who can be the bridge between the Eisenhower way of running the economy and the Keynesian way of running the economy, to get him more money to be able to rearm. And of course, that's precisely what he's able to do, and things like the tax reform and so on is the perfect amalgamation or a kind of a reaching out, if you like, a compromise, a grand bargain with Keynesian economics.
This whole thing is just so interesting, I think, because as you pointed out, Richard, and as you write about, you've got these liberals, many of them on the Harvard faculty, who do not like this appointment, who warn against the appointment, and Kennedy proceeds anyway. I think if I have this right, and you can correct me, Richard, but I'm pretty sure that Kennedy got in his own car, drove it himself. Talk about a different age. He's the president-elect of the United States. He hops in the car, turns the ignition, drives himself over to Dillon's house to basically finalize this appointment. It's just extraordinary.
And is not followed, and journalists don't get kind of a whiff of it.
He just sort of drives over there.
And I mean, just again to emphasize the difference of the age, that the very first time that Douglas Dillon was sounded out in the way that very often happens with these kind of appointments, it was actually Philip Graham, from the Washington Post, who was a friend of both,
yes,
who was the initial go-between, and Catherine Graham in her memoirs tells the story of Phil Graham phoning Dillon and saying, "I need to come and see you." Dillon saying, "I can't, I'm actually hosting a dinner for Republican donors for Nixon, for the defeated candidate in the House in Belmont Road." And but Graham insists that he has to come. So he goes to the house, and according to Catherine Graham, he literally climbs in through the bathroom window at the back of the house, presumably finds some slightly startled staff member there. Dillon is pulled out of the dinner, and that's the first time that he hears that the president-elect would like to know whether he might consider having his name added to the shortlist. Different times.
Different time. So if we think about, let's look at the whole era of talk a little bit about his era as Secretary of the Treasury, the Dillon era. What would you say, Richard, and you write about this, of course, but you can talk a little bit about it here. Is there a signature achievement or one or two that you would single out are especially important in maybe making this the Dillon era?
So I think the signature piece of legislation clearly is the Revenue Act of 1964. I mean, this is a remarkable piece of legislation, just simply in the slashing of taxes, the whole notion of a rising tide floats all boats, the phrase that President Kennedy used, is kind of really symbolized by that. And it takes place within a broader context of an economy that is just frankly remarkable. There's something like 50 odd months of continuous growth, it's record employment, lowest levels of unemployment, industrial production, record factory week. I mean, you can just go on and on and on with these achievements, and all of it is done without overheating the economy. So, he really does manage to get that kind of Goldilocks approach to the economy where it's not too hot and not too cold. And it's why you have people like Paul Samuelson, the kind of one of the great economists of the period, who again was somebody who was not in favour of the appointment when Dillon finally resigns in 1965, having been persuaded by Johnson to hang on for a little bit longer. Samuelson says, that those in the future will bow down. In respect of Douglas Dillon for what he's done for the economy. Even on the balance of payments and the gold crisis, even there he had some measure of success. So, I think that it's generally considered that he's one of the great Treasury Secretaries.
OECD is an important, where he's highly important as well. What about, obviously the 1960s are a period of in which civil rights is very much on the agenda. Can you say a little bit about Dillon's view of race, or the degree to which this was something that he thought about or he engaged with?
So, I think that it's important to say that Douglas Dillon, his view on these kind of things was definitely incremental. That, he's not somebody who's agitating for major reform. On the other hand, he does a number of very important things on the question of race. First of all, he finds it disgraceful that, for example, various revenue inspecting offices around the country are segregated, and including social clubs. And so, he immediately, on coming to office, says that cannot happen, and so that is banned. He tries to encourage and to put in place a scheme for bringing through young black economists into the Treasury, and there are a number of successes on that. And the Coast Guard, which falls under the purview of the Secretary of the Treasury, again is kind of something that he's after them all the time to expand their recruitment, to make sure that they kind of do everything that they can to get out into underserved communities and try. And so, there is a legacy. It's a small legacy, but in the Coast Guard, they do kind of begin the kind of gradual process of diversification. So, I think it's something that, as with many of those characters in the kind of the Kennedy administration, I think that what they're struck by is just basic unfairness, actually. That you just look at something and what you see there is something that is obviously unfair and needs to be
rectified.
And of course, he is involved in the famous March on Washington, where obviously Martin Luther King makes his famous speech. The Treasury and Douglas Dillon are actually involved in setting that up and in funding that. So in some ways, it's a good example of where we started with Rorty and the idea of those who are secure lending a hand, the establishment lending a hand to effect social change.
Tell us a little bit about the end, or maybe there's two questions here. One is why he decides to leave the government. Talk a little bit about that, and if I recall correctly from the book, LBJ, President Johnson said to him something like, I want to have you back, or we're going to make sure that you come back into government, presumably in a senior position or elected office, who knows? Of course, he chooses not to do that. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about both of those questions.
Yeah, so Johnson actually is a good example of the way in which, Douglas Dillon is so appreciated. If you'll just excuse me for one moment. That Lyndon Johnson did not like Douglas Dillon when he first started. He mistrusted him, thought that, or rather distrusted him, thought that he was a kind of a Kennedy person, but very quickly changes his mind about him. And as you say, in the 1964 election, on the night of the election, he phones Dillon and he says, thank you for everything you've done. I really want you to stay. Dillon says, no, I'd always promised that I was going to do one term, then I have to go back to Dillon Reed. Johnson says, well, look, I please come and talk about it. So he sends a plane down to Jupiter Island, flies him up to the LBJ ranch, and puts the hard press on him, the famous hard press.
As Johnson could do.
Exactly. And so kind of Dillon says, well, look, I'll stay for 6 months so that you can you can find a successor, and we can make this work. And Johnson just doesn't do anything about it. And so in the end, Dillon has to say to him, look, I'm going to set a date of the top of my head. I think it's the 1st of April.
Is his father, I know I still want to hear, why he didn't come back. The second question I want to, but just to interject, is the father an important factor in him having to resign, saying, you've got to come back to Dillon Reed, or?
Well, he's his own man. I think he felt a sense of obligation that his father was very keen for him to be ambassador to Paris in '53. Yeah. When he went to the State Department, he was not happy. When he went to the Treasury, he was not happy. He basically thought that he should be back on Wall Street and making things happen there. So I think that by 1965, I think he felt that he owed it to the family and to the firm. And
do you think
so
he would have liked to stay had it not been for that?
I think he was exhausted. I mean, it's interesting I'd had the opportunity to talk to both of his daughters, and they both said that by 1965.
He was ready.
He was exhausted by Washington politics, and you have to remember this was no ordinary time. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination of the president, working for a president in Johnson who had a very different kind of disposition to the president that had originally appointed him. I think he just felt by 1965 that enough was enough. He was invited back on several occasions by Johnson. At one stage, Johnson asked him to come back into the State Department, initially as number 2, but then to replace Dean Rusk. But he said no to that. He did get involved as one of the so-called wise men on Vietnam.
1968,
but, and again, his daughters, or in fact Mark Collins's mother, Phyllis, remembers Hubert Humphrey coming in 68 to sound him out as a possible bipartisan pick for vice president. But again, that was not something that he was interested in. I couldn't really see Douglas Dillon at that 1968 Chicago convention. I don't think that would have been his thing at all.
And just to pursue this a little further, what was his view of LBJ? You've talked a little bit about what LBJ thought of him. What about the reverse?
I think he respected him. He was very, very upset when stories were published in papers and books kind of saying that LBJ was personally disrespectful to him, because he said that was never ever the case. In fact,
okay.
kind of although on occasion their conversations would be, when they were talking about politics, would be kind of, quite strong. He was always personally very courteous to him. Okay. I think he respected Johnson politically. I think that he genuinely felt that, in taking over the presidency, he did a good job, and they worked very well together on the Revenue Act. Initially, Johnson thought that Dillon didn't know what he was doing. He thought that he didn't understand the politics, but he then realized very quickly that actually Dillon knew that the key was Senator Harry Byrd from the Senate Finance Committee, that they had to bring the budget in, and then they dovetailed perfectly.
That's Johnson's language right there.
And so then Johnson was the one bringing Byrd in and serving him his favorite potato soup in the White House, and there was Dillon, kind of on the side, just letting this all. I mean, they worked brilliantly together.
It's such a great story, because it's hard to imagine two people on the surface more different than Lyndon Johnson in terms of his background, and Douglas Dillon in terms of his temperament, personality, and yet, as you say, they work together. So the last, as we draw towards the end, I do want to ask you, Richard, about that era and maybe draw a connection to our own. You and I are we're tilling the same fields, really. Mid 20th century America. It's far from perfect. We've sort of talked about segregation, obviously, and if you were an African American customer at, say, richest department store in Atlanta, you couldn't try on clothing in the fall of 1960. You couldn't sit in the restaurants in the fall of 1960. You couldn't you couldn't do what a white customer could do. And of course, lots of stories about this. Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in America, so it wasn't just a Southern thing. And yet, the sense one has is that it was a time in which there was a sense that society was moving forward, however intermittently. There was a sense that politics could speak to the yearnings of people, a belief in compromise on the part of politicians of both parties. A sense, which of course I associate with, in my own work, with John F. Kennedy, but I think it also applies to Douglas Dillon, that civility in the public sphere prevents dehumanization. And I think that's profoundly important. And of course, one can't help then think about where we are today. Could you reflect a little bit on this, either in the context of that era, or if you want to talk a little bit about what we seem to have lost?
So I think you're absolutely right in what you say about this being a reforming era. There's a sense that period, and I suppose you'd start with Truman, from this post-war period from Truman through Eisenhower, Kennedy, through to really 1964 and the Revenue Act and the Civil Rights Act, is this kind of period of reform and progress, and it's done in a way. One of the words that I use in the conclusion of the book, which is drawing on my experience as a British historian, but this is the way that the mid-19th century Britain is described, is that it seems to me it's an age of equipoise. That, where it is possible for a Republican to serve in a Democratic administration, where there is this sense of civility, there is a sense of balance, there is a sense of being able to compromise, to give and to take. So I think it definitely is a completely different kind of age and a different kind of media environment as well, where politicians didn't come under the kind of intense scrutiny. And some of that is not good, But other parts of it, I think, it was better that politicians were able to be ordinary people in some ways.
Yeah.
I think there's a contrast with today in kind of obvious ways that it seems much harder to work across the aisle. It seems much harder to find that sense of balance. The rhetoric, I think, is harsher than it was in the 50s and 60s.
I think I agree with you completely. And there's also a sense, in 1964, I think it was Harris or Gallup, one of the major pollsters, asked Americans, do you trust government to do the right thing, if not all the time, at least most of the time? 77% said yes. That same question in 2022 or maybe 2021, it was something like 19%. So, and lots of reasons for this, which we won't get into tonight, but having to do partly with Vietnam and I think Watergate and subsequent developments. But I guess I'm in a sense just affirming what you've just said. And it's maybe in particular, not to get partisan, but it's a different, in a sense, a different Republican Party in that era and Democratic Party. And one wonders what Douglas Dillon would say about where the party is today. So
I think that he was part of a group that's often described as modern Republicans.
Yeah.
And I think you're right that kind of modern republicanism is not something that we see very much of today. But equally, I think the Democratic Party of Truman and Kennedy is very different to the Democratic Party today. So it's a completely different landscape. Look, we don't want to sentimentalize it. Of course we don't. For all the reasons that you explain. But I think there's one other aspect to it as well, and it's generational. That President Eisenhower was also the supreme Allied commander who led the Anglo-American forces during D-Day. John F. Kennedy and Douglas Dillon were part of the so-called greatest generation who fought in that war. So I think that in some ways their politics is making that idea from the war made manifest in the political sphere.
Yeah, I suppose as we close, and this is something that President Kennedy often said, but I think it very much speaks. I think it's also something that Douglas Dillon would affirm, which is this idea that what Americans have in common is more important than what divides them. So there was a sense that yes, there are these divisions. Yes, this is imperfect, but we're in this together. And I'll speak for myself. It seems, especially with an election 2 weeks away, that somehow we need to recapture that sense, which I think, by the way, most Americans actually adhere to. But we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank you, Richard, for this opportunity to chat with you. Thank all of you for being here today, and thanks to the library.
That's good.